Today on Inspired Money.
And our 5 little city blocks in Santa Monica are these old brick buildings that were warehouses in the 20s and 30s that have become creative little enclaves, and we're surrounded by filmmakers and musicians and artists, and it's a little creative community. And I want to open this little gathering place, and I hired consultants that had opened little artisan coffee shops. And what I really did, I asked each one of those people at some point in my relationship with them, is like, is there any crazy thing you've now opened or helped or consulted to open 20 of these coffee shops? Is there anything that you've always wanted to do but have never done, or an owner has never let you do it?
This is episode 147 with Emmy-award winning commercial director, documentary filmmaker, and entrepreneur, Erich Joiner. Welcome to Inspired Money. My name is Andy Wong, a managing partner at Runnymede Capital Management. Each week, we bring you an interesting person to help you get inspired, shift your perspectives on money, and achieve incredible things. From making it to giving it away, Inspired Money means making a difference, creating something bigger than oneself, and maybe, just maybe, making the world a better place. Thank you for joining me. Hey, Inspired Moneymaker. Welcome back. If this is your first time listening, welcome. Today we've got a great guest, Erich Joiner. He's owned multiple businesses. He has over 2 decades of experience as an award-winning director, filmmaker, and he's founder of a creative production company. He's directed several commercials selected as part of the permanent collection of the New York Museum of Modern Art, and Shots Magazine ranked him as one of the top 10 commercial directors in the world. In this episode, you'll learn insights from a successful creative entrepreneur. We learn what makes a great campaign, including developing the messaging and stories for a successful one like Got Milk. And we get a case study about how Erich went about opening a specialty coffee shop, a passion project that has turned today's guest into quite the coffee expert. Now let's get inspired with Erich Joiner. Hey, it's Andy again. My apologies. Due to technical issues, I lost the beginning of this interview, so I need to fill you in. Erich's earliest childhood memory of money was finding loose change with his grandfather, collecting it, and boiling it because they felt that the money was dirty and needed to be cleaned. He was born and raised in Flushing, New York, so it may have been a wise move to boil the coins that he found on the city streets. His dad was an art director in the era of advertising portrayed in the award-winning series Mad Men. Erich credits his dad for teaching him at an early age that failure is a part of creativity, something to be embraced and not feared. That was a valuable lesson that continues to help him as a creative, a director, and a business owner. At age 7, Erich moved to Southern California. There, he went through a slightly rebellious phase, consumed by punk rock music and a growing love of surfing. We begin our interview with Erich in Pasadena, California, where he was a student at the Art Center College of Design. He demonstrates an early business sense and explains why he switched his major from filmmaking to advertising.
The advertising students were graduating and getting jobs with salaries and had some consistency to it. And I remember thinking to myself that both fields really relied on creativity and storytelling. And I loved the idea behind art. And even if it was fine art, I love when I see a Banksy piece, I go, oh gosh, what a brilliant thought or an idea that was put into this piece of art. And I thought the advertising people at the time, they were all about the idea. So I ended up graduating with an advertising degree. I moved up to San Francisco, and I worked at when I started there, it was a small advertising agency. And I worked there for 5 years. And over the course of that time, it grew probably 3 or 4 times in both billings and the number of people that worked there. And I had a great experience there, and I loved it.
After a while, Erich wants to return to directing, and the entrepreneur in him begins to surface.
Toward the end of my tenure there, I went to the owners, which I'd become very good friends with, and I said, hey, I really want to go into being a director, which is really something that I loved in college and stuff like that. And the way it works at an advertising agency, you work with a client and you come up with a strategy and you kind of write and think of the idea, and then you hire a director. And so I told them I really would like to become a director, and they convinced me to stay on for a little longer and said that I could direct some projects through them, which I did, for a while. And then I finally decided, okay, this is time to move on. I moved back to LA, which is basically where I grew up, and I opened a company. I remember going into an accountant's office that did the accounting for many. So I opened a commercial production company. I became a director and opened a company with a friend of mine at the time. And I remember going into an accountant's office and sitting down and saying, oh, we want to open this commercial production company. And the accountant who handled other commercial production company looked at us, and I can't remember exactly how old I was. I was probably late 20s. And he said, well, have you owned a company? Do you know what it takes? And I was like, nope, well, I'm just going to do it. And looking back on it now, I like, oh my gosh, it was a little ambitious and maybe a little bit crazy, but I just did it.
But you had worked on some really cool campaigns and worked with recognizable brands and companies.
I did.
But I guess the question as to, do you know what it takes to run a company? You couldn't answer that yet.
I could not. And I guess I would say ever since I was a kid, I was a bit of an entrepreneur, all the way from paper routes and then I got into auto racing. Oh, there's an earlier part of my story where I thought, okay, I want to be a race car driver. But no, I didn't really have that much experience at all with owning a company or starting it or knowing anything. And I do, looking back on it now, I think not having that experience, actually, I was a little more brave. Now that I know what it takes, it's like, wow, it takes a lot.
We've heard this recurring theme before. Sometimes risk just looks different when you're young and don't have a lot to lose. It's also a great time to immerse yourself in your work and learn everything that you can.
But it hit me at a time in my life when I didn't have kids. I didn't have a lot of obligations, and I had the luxury. And I tell a lot of people this. I went to college, but my first job was like grad school. And I really embraced it. And I was young and all years I listened. I was so fortunate to work with so many talented people in our business and be inspired by them and learn from them. Yet I was young and I had a bit of edge to me. And I really kind of fell on my laurels and drove a stake in the ground, especially creatively at the time, and just fought for making the best creative and storytelling for the brands that I was fortunate enough to work with. And I got to essentially hire directors and production companies that I would go on to be a competitor of it. But I got to then sort of from the other side, I got to see how they conducted a pre-production meeting and on set, how they conducted themselves and things like that. And I got to work with some of the best talent and directors, commercial directors in that era and that time. I was one of the few people that started the Got Milk campaign, and I worked on Sega and Porsche and just amazing brands, and got to be a part of some amazing work at the time. And it became like my grad school. And so when I did open a company, I felt like I had a leg up on some of that stuff, but others, I surrounded myself. And this is something that I still adhere to today after now owning many companies and ventures and investing in people. I really try to surround myself with really intelligent, smart, passionate people.
So tell us a little bit more about your company, Tool of North America. When you founded that, did you have a vision to be doing something differently than what you had been doing? What was your vision in those early days?
Yes, it definitely, and I think this is true today. And I've started companies more recently. I do a lot of thinking about that. I probably, to a certain degree, overthink that part of it. So, Tool, as we call it, or Tool of North America, it had that vision of being different. At the time we were young, most of the other production companies we were competing with, so this was 1995. Most of the other companies were well-funded, big companies, well-established. There were not a lot of them at the time. Now there's thousands of commercial production companies. It was also the David and Goliath kind of story. But I think one of the things that turbocharged and propelled it is I had done a body of work and created a body of work that won a lot of awards at the time. I had a partner that I had worked with, and he had also won a lot of creative awards at the time. Sort of the biggest award show in our industry is probably at the Cannes Advertising Festival, and we had won a lot of awards there, and the DNAD show in London and Clio's in America.
What was one of the projects that won you a lot of that acclaim and recognition?
There was a smattering of them over that 5 years when I worked at the ad agency. Probably the most famous one that's gone on today is the Got Milk campaign. As that little client came into our ad agency as hey, we want to sell milk and do it a little differently. And there were a couple existing campaigns that were going on, and they all kind of had a health message before it. There was one, I think the tagline was "Milk does a body good." And there was another one. There were basically three entities promoting milk. There were the people, I think, as I know, that own the cows. Then there were the people that own the processing facilities that bought the milk from the cows and processing the milk. And then there were the people that actually put it into containers with brands on it that sold the milk. And this was a client that was the milk processing board. And it was actually the California Milk Processing Board. So it was regional at the time. And we sort of came up with this idea and said, let's not look at the health message of the milk. Let's think about foods that milk goes with. Hand in hand with, so much so to the point that if you don't have milk, you're kind of screwed. And so we proceeded to do a bunch of messages and stories about how someone, whether they loved milk in their coffee or milk in their cereal, or they had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and wanted a glass of milk, or chocolate brownies and wanted milk, and especially cereal, or if you didn't have it, you were screwed. And it's that most of them told a little story about that. And then someone went to the refrigerator or wherever, and they didn't have milk. And all of a sudden, it was almost like a little bit of a nightmare. And it ended always with the tagline of "Got Milk."
Eric, when you're brainstorming an idea like that, are you trying to come up with a story and asking the question, what's going to resonate with the most people?
I don't know that I would say the most people. I was taught in advertising, both in school and for this ad agency that I started with, that truth and honesty in advertising was paramount. And I think that if you think about that product and how it might work in your life, and you kind of talk to consumers that use that type of product, you find all these truths about it. And I think you want to do something that's different, that's compelling. I always believe the best kind of messaging or stories is something that's also very entertaining, and it translates into being more memorable. I don't know that I think about what will connect with the most, the largest number of people. I think I go, is this a sort of an interesting, memorable message that's true? And I also try to treat people like they are smart and that they can put two and two together. And oftentimes, if they do in a message, just like the Got Milk, they'll figure it out for themselves, and they're rewarded, for that. So I think I base it on sort of a truth about the product and then a unique way of showing that story.
I love that. It's simple in that in creating the story, you're just focused on a truth, making a story compelling, and maybe having an entertaining aspect to it. If you can achieve those things, then having that widespread appreciation or resonance with people, that's the byproduct.
Yes. And I do think, when I think you look at some of the most memorable, most effective, most beloved advertising in the world, it sort of has that. It treats the viewer, the consumer, like they're an intelligent person. And, I had someone I work for that always would say, let's speak to the highest common denominator in this target market. I think that, it needs to be a very simple communication that is based in truth. And very importantly, it needs to be entertaining, because in our everyday life, we're confronted with so many messages from so many brands, and only so many of them can be memorable. And that entertaining part is key.
I read this quote from an article from you. You said, "The people here are all about the idea. Suddenly, we're having more freedom to tell the story. And one thing we know, if it's going viral, it has to be entertaining."
It's very true. When I started out my career in the 90s, that kind of viral thing really wasn't around so much. And I think in advertising terms, it was almost a commercial came on and interrupted the content that you were watching. If you were watching a football game, a sporting event, or a TV show or the news, and it was sort of, the term was, it was sort of a roadblock to get you to that next piece of content. You were forced to watch it. But even back then, for it to be memorable, it in a weird way, before viral was even around, it had to be viral. I think, you wanted to talk about it or pass it around is really what viral, I guess, went on to be. But then, after that, with the advent of the internet and in today's world, it really does need to be entertaining and, thought-provoking.
So is it a subtle change in storytelling, just because the delivery system or the way that consumers consume that information has changed?
I guess I've been in this business. I've had Tool now a few months ago. We had our 25th anniversary. So I have been in this business long enough to now see trends. And one thing I always say about any business is everything will always change. And I had a good friend of mine, and someone I used to work with, that said, if you really knew what was going to happen tomorrow or the next day, life would be pretty boring. But there are some trends I feel like I've seen in storytelling for brands over the years. And you see some of those trends there. There's comedy, there's kind of heartfelt. I think in the last decade or so, there's been a very docu-style commercial. And I think, now I have kids in high school, and I watch what their content consumption habits are and the things they talk about. It's very interesting. And what is topical for them and what they're interested in, and even the tone of messaging, for my kids. And I see it with my clients, and we have many meetings about it, and we look at focus groups, and they're definitely, as people's values kind of meander and big current events happen. After 9/11, we definitely saw a trend. When I got into this business in 95, we very quickly kind of rode the wave of what I would call the dot-com boom. And there was sort of this gold rush of not only dot-com companies, but in the marketing and the advertising world. It was almost that it seemed like at the time that you would come up with this idea for a business, you would quickly get a domain name for a website, and you'd go, and then you'd put 90% of your money into making funny commercials about that domain name and try to get a rush of people to start clicking on it, whether it was stamps online or buying books online for Amazon at the time. And you kind of wanted to be the leader in that field. And comedy through that period was huge. And then what happened, it seemed like 9/11 happened. And all of a sudden, no brand wanted to really, everyone wanted to have more of a soulful, thoughtful approach to brand storytelling for years. So I think you kind of have these events, and then I'm not sure exactly what spawned it, but probably about 10 years ago, so maybe around 2010, we started to really see the advent of what I would call this docu-style storytelling, commercial making, where you kind of really dove in deep to a personality within the company or a personality that used that product and talked to them about that. And I think all three of those things, along with other type of, there's some commercials that are very tabletop driven and stuff like that. They're all three around, but I think they kind of meander in and out. But I think that the biggest thing that has changed and is how people consume content and entertainment now. And they have a choice of not only when to watch it, but what to watch. And do they want to be interrupted by it or how? And I think it's always the struggle of, am I going to pay for content, which means it basically has no brand message or very little brand messaging, or do I want it free? So but it's what gets me excited about the company, and Tool has really evolved, and it certainly is not the company it was 25 years ago when we started, which we mostly did 30-second TV commercials on Super Bowl and TV shows and sporting events. And now that is still a big part of the company, but we do digital things, interactive things. We do experiential things at events. We do little documentary films that are sponsored by brands, and we do so much more now.
Yeah, experiential at events is such a great way to introduce a brand to people because it's interactive. What are your thoughts on advertising and brand messaging in a post-COVID-19 world as we come out of shelter in place and stay at home? Is that like a 9/11 that it's going to change the way that messaging from a company should be formulated and expressed?
I absolutely think it will. And as we went into this COVID terrible situation, but this COVID situation, as a lot of these things have been in the past, I've now owned Tool and other companies, but I've owned Tool for 25 years, and I feel like I've been through the .com crisis. I've been through 9/11. I've been through the housing crash in 07, 08, sort of the Europe crisis in like 2012, 13. So things will change in brand messaging after COVID. We've had a lot of meetings recently at Tool on looking at things and how they will change. I've always sort of, as a company owner, you really go, okay, you roll up your sleeves, and there's a part of it that I actually enjoy, events where you go creatively. Now we get to really look at how they might change. And a lot of times by an event like this, that change something, it could be things that were kind of in the making and creeping along at 5 miles an hour, but all of a sudden an event like this speeds it up to 100 miles an hour. And, but I do think that we have a division at Tool that in, I don't know, the last 3 to 5 years focused on experiential, which is basically making just fantastic events. And we did big things at Comic-Con and Coachella and South by Southwest, and amazing things that we're very proud of, where people got to go in and experience those things, physically interact with things. And at first, I have to tell you, Andrew, I was kind of surprised at the budgets that a brand would spend on this, and, to usher maybe 5,000 people through an experience. But what we did, we really kind of focused on it at Tool, is we made sure that all those experiences were sort of shareable, that people would pull out their phone, their smartphone, and take a picture of themselves and then pass it to their 500 friends. And so all of a sudden you go, okay, it's 5,000 people going through this, but really 5 million people are seeing this. And I think going forward, and we've talked a lot about this at Tool, is I think, and we've talked about this because we've looked at what we've done in the past. We also have a fairly robust interactive digital department, and this was probably created 11 years ago, maybe 12 now, sort of before we got into experiential, where we would create microsites for clients that were very interactive. We then went on and do VR things for brands and clients, these experiences that they could experience at home. We then, 4 or 5 years ago, kind of started doing the actual physical events, like at Comic-Con. And but I think coming out of this, I think it'll be a combination of an experience, but it might be something that you can experience at home or in a safer place for a while. I don't know how all that's going to work. So we're sort of taking what we've learned in a physical experience place and combining it with our interactive digital team. And we're really starting to, use this time to have meetings about that.
Well, I know that you've been a big advocate and believer in augmented reality and virtual reality and incorporating that into the work that you do.
We've had many Zoom or Google Hangout kind of calls about that. And I do think as an entrepreneur, as a creative person, I get excited about that. That kind of change. I've been a glasses half full person my whole life, but really sitting down, rolling up our sleeves and go, oh my gosh, we can start to think about doing this kind of project now and that kind of project, and combining these two things and doing things we have not done before. And we've already started to have conversations with some of our trusted clients that we've had over 20 years or more about how to do that stuff.
Coming up, taking risks as an entrepreneur, how experience empowers you to ask the right questions. And we dig into how a non-coffee drinker opens an artisan coffee shop. All that and more right after this short break. The show notes for this episode can be found at inspiredmoney.fm/147. If you're listening in your car or wherever you are, check the show notes if you want to learn more about Erich, Tool of North America, and other things mentioned in this episode. It's time for the Runnymede Money Tip of the Week. I'm frequently asked about my favorite investing or money books. One that's always stayed on my list is One Up on Wall Street by Peter Lynch, and it's one of the first investing books that I ever read. I remember that my dad gave it to me when I graduated high school, and it provides very foundational principles of stock investing. I want to share 2 excerpts with you. Here's the first one. In Wall Street parlance, a 10-bagger is a stock in which you've made 10 times your money. I suspect this is a highly technical term borrowed from baseball, which only goes to 4-bagger or a home run. In my business, a 4-bagger is nice, but a 10-bagger is the fiscal equivalent of 2 home runs and a double. If you've ever had a 10-bagger in the stock market, you know how appealing it can be. I developed a passion for making 10 times my money early in my investing career. The first stock I ever bought, Flying Tiger Airlines, turned out to be a multi-bagger that put me through graduate school. I love this. Peter Lynch managed Fidelity's Magellan Fund from 1977 until 1990, averaging a 29.2% annual return. As of 2003, this had the best 20-year return of any mutual fund ever. On the flip side, here's some sage advice from a chapter entitled Stocks I'd Avoid. If I could avoid a single stock, it would be the hottest stock in the hottest industry, the one that gets the most favorable publicity, the one that every investor hears about in the carpool or on the commuter train, and succumbing to the social pressure, often buys. Hot stocks can go up fast, usually out of sight of any of the known landmarks of value. But since there's nothing but hope and thin air to support them, they fall just as quickly. If you aren't clever at selling hot stocks, and the fact that you've bought them is a clue that you won't be, you'll soon see your profits turn into losses, because when the stock price falls, it's not going to fall slowly, nor is it likely to stop at the level where you jumped on. Again, this is some great advice. If you want to read more, I'll leave a link to this book in the show notes. That's the Runnymede Money Tip of the Week. Inspired Money is brought to you by Runnymede Capital Management. We help you to plan, invest, and worry less. So this feature returns the Inspired Moneymaker of the Week. I'm spotlighting Ethan, who wrote a review at Apple Podcasts. He wrote, "I enjoy this podcast. On episode 132, discussing producing and promoting a Hawaiian music show falls in line with a lot of my experience producing shows. Love the Jim Kima West inclusions on the podcast. If you haven't listened to episode 132, it started with music. That was my experiment into a shorter 22-minute edited narrative episode that shared my personal story about hosting Hawaiian music concerts in my town. An extra shout out to Norman Cella of Podlovers Asia podcast. He curated a list of 5 podcast episodes with the theme Stories Across Asia for the Earbuds Collective newsletter. It Started with Music was on his list. So thank you, Ethan, Norman, and Ariel, founder of Earbuds Collective, for the mention and kind words. If you want to be the next Inspired Moneymaker of the Week, since we've been talking books in several episodes recently, tell me what book you've been reading or a favorite book that you've read. Share it to social media and tag me. I'm inspiredmoney.fm on Instagram or at RunnymedeCap. That's RUNNYMEDECAP, short for Runnymede Capital. Use the hashtag InspiredMoney. I'd love to hear your book recommendations, whether they're about money or not. And you can always email me at inspiredmoney.fm/Andy. I look forward to hearing from you, and you might just be mentioned in a future Inspired Money episode. You're listening to Inspired Money. I'm Andy Wong. Earlier, you mentioned that you almost took a different path and wanted to be a professional race car driver. As an entrepreneur and owner of different businesses and as an investor, as a race car driver, are there similarities in your view when it comes to analyzing risk to reward?
Oh my gosh. Now that you put it that way, that's very interesting. I think there are, I've never really thought of that way, Andrew, but there definitely is. There's a very real risk in driving a race car. And I think at the end of the day, and through high school and before college, that was really why I had a father that not only loved art, but he loved cars. And he would race on the weekends, as just a hobbyist or a gentleman racer. And so he put me in cars and a go-kart at an early age, and I grew to really enjoy it. And I thought I might do that, and I was fairly successful as a young kind of kid. But then I had a friend that got hurt badly, and it was in the era in the 80s when people would cars weren't as safe as they were today. Race cars weren't, and I kind of was like, gosh, I know I'm pretty good at this, but I'm not sure I want to do this. So I think the risk, especially back then, was a very real thing, and it still is now. There was a point in my directing career, and when I worked at the ad agency, I worked on 2 big car accounts, Isuzu and Porsche, and I love it because my love of cars was so great. I always wanted to direct car commercials, and early in my directing career, I could not get a car manufacturer on board for me to direct a car commercial. And so what I started doing then, I said, I'm going to go back to racing kind of on the weekends as an amateur. And I'm going to try to use that as a calling card, and say, look, I race cars, I do this and whatnot. So I got into racing. It started out as to really, so I could lure manufacturers to do car commercials. But then I've gone on with it in and out professionally and whatnot. And to this day, I still race. I just had a race in Sebring, Florida 2 months ago, maybe right before this thing in March. And they're even in a safe modern car nowadays. There is a very real risk to reward. And I think I told you much earlier, I was taught at a very early age to not fear failure. And in my creative life, I definitely, I think much to my wife's chagrin, I've opened other businesses. I have a interesting coffee shop business, and I have other businesses, and I like coming at those businesses, even with the coffee shop, is sitting down going, I hired consultants. What I do when I start a business, I really take a deep dive in it. Before I go to bed at night, and I'll go to bed pretty late at night, I will read books. I will watch videos. I will, and even the coffee business, I'd never owned a restaurant. I didn't even drink coffee at the time. There was something I loved about a little coffee shop. It was a little gathering place, and I wanted to put it near my office in Santa Monica, and our 5 little city blocks in Santa Monica are these old brick buildings that were warehouses in the 20s and 30s that have become creative little enclaves, and we're surrounded by filmmakers and musicians and artists, and it's a little creative community. And the way the city designed that community, there wasn't really a place you could walk and get a cup of coffee. You had to get in a car, which is a big problem with LA and many cities. But, I really sat down and said, I want to open this little gathering place. And I took a lot of risks in opening that business. And I guess I did and I didn't. I hired consultants that had opened little artisan coffee shops. And what I really did, I asked each one of those people at some point in my relationship with them, is like, is there any crazy thing you've now opened or helped or consulted to open 20 of these coffee shops? Is there anything that you've always wanted to do but have never done, or an owner has never let you do it?
Ooh, killer question.
As you've owned several businesses, you just get better at it, more courageous with things. And that's definitely something I learned years ago. I don't think when I opened Tool 25 years ago, I would have asked those questions, but now I enjoy those questions. I enjoy collaboration. And I think when I was younger, I was like, I have this vision and this is the way I want it to be. And as I get older and more mature, and I do the same on the film set, I enjoy collaboration I enjoy it with the brands on the film set. I enjoy it with the advertising agency, and going into the coffee shop, I asked the baristas, the manager, we talk about things and process and what would be cool. The vision is always important. And even down to the coffee shop, what are we about? What are we about? What do we want to stand for here? And making sure that everyone was in line with that vision, just like we are at Tool. But to ask that question to those people, and I think no matter what business you're starting, if you really ask smart people and people that have been in that business that question, it kind of sets them back for a minute. And I remember asking Tyler, this guy that I worked with on, he was a consultant I hired on, and he'd opened many coffee shops. And I remember 2 things about my relationship. One is when I asked him that question, he really sat back and he paused for a good 10 seconds. And he was like, wow, that's really interesting. And so he came up with 2 ideas right away. And he said, I need to think about some more. And he came up with a 3rd one. And I know one I remember implementing right away. Then there was a manager I went on to hire, and he had an idea, and I implemented that right away.
What things did you implement?
Tyler, the consultant, it was a really interesting thing. He said at the time, and now this was maybe 4 years ago, just to put it in context. He said, I've always wanted to open a coffee shop. And what you have to know, so he's a guy that owned a few coffee shops himself, and then started this business on consulting. What I would say in the coffee world, it's 3rd wave coffee shops or artisan coffee shops. So these are the places you might see in Brooklyn or Austin or LA that, these are coffee lovers to the nth degree. And so what he said is, I've never done this in one of my coffee shops. I've never done it for a client. I think I might have suggested, but no one took the risk of doing it. And he said, I would love to have a cashless coffee shop. And I looked at him and I said, well, that's interesting. why? And I have to tell you, Andrew, because in my mind, and I knew in my mind what I thought the answer was. And I thought it would be because, oh, you're dealing with cash and there'd be a problem with trust and theft, possibly. But it was not. And his reason was, Eric, and he had two reasons for it. And neither of it was security or theft, neither reason. Number one, and his biggest reason for it was, he says, cash is, this is a weird circle around, comes back to what my grandfather, boiling the money. He said, cash is dirty, and you're working in a food establishment in a very small kind of space. And you have people and somebody that is literally at the end of the day. And this is another funny story. I owned a car wash at the time, and I remember counting money, every once in a while, a month or so at this car wash. But having that person in this food establishment, and he firsthand experienced this because he owned a coffee shop and he was the one at the register taking the cash. He goes, I'd look down at my fingertips after an hour and a half or so, and they were black. And he said, I would think to myself, oh my gosh, this is like so terrible. And then here I am grabbing a coffee cup and handing it to a person, or a muffin, or, something like that. So he said the biggest reason was, he just said, I just think cash is just so dirty and unhealthy. And the second reason, he said, is it's such a waste of time, because the way really you need to do it just so the security of the cash is okay is you have a little coffee shop with maybe 5 people working on at any one given shift. And you have such an inefficient, wasted use of time where you go, there's basically, in order for that cash store to be secure, you have to devote one person to just doing that discipline. And that way you knew if the money came up short, then you could go, that person was accountable. And what that person needs to do to be accountable is at the beginning of their shift, they have to take 20 minutes out of their day. They have to count that cash drawer and go, okay, there's $500 in cash here, all the pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, dollars. And then at the end of the shift, they take 20 minutes, they count it again. And after they count it, they hand it to the next shift and go, you recount this. And that person takes 20 minutes. So there's 2 reasons where the efficiency of time, but his big reason was the dirtiness of it, I guess. And it's interesting in this COVID kind of era, but, and this was way before that. I think a year or 2 after we implemented that, there was a little bit of blowback. We never saw it on establishments not accepting cash. We kind of quickly came around because we always offered gift cards. So we would always accept cash. But what we would say is, oh, okay, because we didn't have a cash drawer, if you only have cash with you, buy this gift card and we'll put, I don't know, $3.75 on this gift card. You can use it to, pay for it. But those were the 2 things that he recommended.
Great workaround, and what a great question.
Yeah, it is, and I highly recommend whatever the business, that you're thinking about starting, or even if you have a business. We at Tool, we have so many meetings, and we kind of go around the table. And something I've learned in just creativity and working in an ad agency, anybody can have a great idea. The sort of the harder part is editing those ideas. And sort of, if you go around the table and anyone in your organization or your friend group might have an idea, but I think it's really then thinking through, I guess, back to your question, the risk reward of that idea. And at the time, even for me with the cashless, because obviously you have to put some thought into, am I going to lose business because I don't accept cash? And so whatever the decision that you decide to go with. And I have to say, Andrew, that's not one of those decisions where you go, oh my gosh, that put the little coffee shop, on the map. I think there are other decisions that, did that. There was a big one that I hired a manager, a barista that competes in World Barista Championships and, things like that. And I didn't even know this whole coffee subculture existed. But I have to tell you, Andrew, I should kick myself because I'm in this marketing world, and I should know that whatever the entry. You go to Comic Con, we put on events, at Comic Con, you go to Comic Con and go, oh my God, there's this whole underworld of people that are so passionate about things, but there is this Comic Con type culture for coffee.
Yes, absolutely. I have a neighbor who has since moved away, but he worked at a hedge fund. He was like a quant, he was a math whiz.
Yeah.
And the first time I visited his house, I walked into his kitchen and he says, my hobby is that I'm a barista. Would you like a cup of coffee? And he had all this like Italian espresso making, like hand grinding. It was amazing. But I laughed at the way that he introduced it, saying, oh, my hobby is I'm a barista.
Andrew, I have stories. You don't have a long enough podcast, but I learned so much about coffee. There are so many people that are passionate, like food, about coffee, its making, its origins, and things like that. But what I will say is, so when I asked Ryan, the manager to this day of the coffee shop, who turned out to be a true friend and probably a partner for a long time in coffee, when I asked him, I said, you've owned coffee shops, you've worked at coffee shops. Is there anything that you've always wanted to do, but for whatever reason had never done it, either at your own coffee shop or ones that you've worked at? And he said, yes, there is something. And this is something that I think has really helped define the little coffee company, which now there's, I think by the end of this year, there'll be 5 coffee shops. But he said, when I compete as a barista, we use this coffee that's really rare and interesting coffee, and you can't buy it, and it's not served anywhere in the United States. And I have to tell you, Andrew, I own a bunch of businesses, and I was like, wait a minute. There are thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of coffee shops across America. You're telling me there's like certain kinds of coffee that you cannot get in the United States? I want to hear about that, and why is that? And he went on to say that coffee is becoming, just like your friend that invited over to his house said, it's becoming more like wine, and it's not just a commodity or I'm tired, I want to drink a cup of coffee, but people are really enjoying the flavors and the flavor notes, and farmers are really starting to put their shoulder into really farming coffee well. And he said, when we compete in these barista championships, we use this really curated coffee that's been like cupped and tested and tasted, and it's roasted a certain way. And none of that coffee comes to the U.S. And so obviously as a business owner, I had a bunch of questions. I was like, well, and he showed me this website where it was being auctioned off. And I was like, why is this not coming to the U.S.? And my second question is where is it all going? Because I see it on this website. And I have to tell you that the where is it all going was a really interesting thing, just about people and culture. But it turns out 95% of this coffee was all going to one city in one country, Andrew. And I'll play this game with you. Can you guess? Just take a guess. What city and what country?
That this coffee was going to?
Yes.
Rome, Italy? I have no idea.
Oh, that's interesting because, yes, a few people that I've asked this question have guessed a city in Italy, which makes sense. It goes to Tokyo, Japan. And I have to say, then I started thinking about it going, that's interesting. And I have several anecdotes in my life when I go, oh, that's really interesting. And that makes sense to me. And then he went on to say, here's why coffee shops do not offer it in the United States. Number one, it's more expensive, and it's more expensive on 2 fronts. It's more expensive to buy it from the farmer and this is mostly because it costs more money. It takes more time to basically harvest it. And coffee is the seed of a cherry, and it grows on these trees or these shrubs And when it becomes ripe, usually a coffee farmer, the most economical way of doing it is a farmer looks around and goes, okay, 50% of my crop is ripe. I'm going to hire people for the next 2 weeks to just pick it all. You just strip all the trees. But like any other fruit or piece of produce or farming that happens, if you have a tomato plant in your backyard, not all 10 tomatoes on that plant are ripe at exactly the same time. And so what happens on this high-end coffee is they hire people to not just strip all the coffee cherries off the tree, but they just pick the ripe ones. And the sweetness of the fruit happens in those last few days. As you know, if you eat, it might take months to grow a tomato or a strawberry, but it's that last few days. And if you hit it perfectly, that's when the magic happens, the richness of the flavor and stuff like that. So he said to purchase that coffee from the grower costs a little more money, but it also costs a lot more money to roast it, because when you roast it, you're basically finding out what temperature you need to cook it to for how long. And every batch has a different recipe to do it. So it essentially costs a lot because you're essentially buying 100 pounds of coffee instead of 5,000 pounds. And then with 5,000 pounds, you get that roasting recipe, and then you just duplicate it for, you roast 100 pounds a week, but it's that same recipe. So the roasting costs more. But the biggest reason that intrigued me the most, and it said the most about, I guess, our culture in America, he said, when people have a habit that they like, whether it's beer or coffee, and this is something they consume quite often, they want the same taste every time. And with this exquisite, rare coffee, like a really good bottle of wine, it's different every time. What's consistent about it, Andrew, is it's always smooth and sweet and good, like a good wine. It's not kind of raspy or doesn't leave a bitter taste in you, but it's always a little different. And what he said is, in America, a lot of people, and I'm sure it's true around the world, but a lot of people they go in for that coffee every morning or whatever, and they want that same taste.
And hence you've got Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's. I mean,
yes, very successful companies that have built a whole company infrastructure and culture on that. You go into a McDonald's or a Starbucks, and if you're asking for a Big Mac or a macchiato at Starbucks, and whether it's Tokyo or New York and any time of the year, it's going to taste exactly the same.
You do drink coffee now?
I do drink coffee now. I really enjoy it. A lot of it is just because what I said, our coffee is really smooth, and it actually has a sweetness to it. You don't get that bitter bite at the beginning or kind of that aftertaste of that drifts on. I have a bit of a sweet tooth, and now I can drink coffee without any sugar sweetener in it, and I really enjoy it.
Well, good boy, Bob. I will put all the information in the show notes. Erich, I like to ask all the Inspired Money guests, how do you define success?
I would say, and I think this is something that I try to hand down to my two daughters, is try to find something that you enjoy doing in life and that you find meaningful. And I think that if you're somebody, I think the finance will follow. If you keep your eye on it and you educate yourself in a business fashion, the finance, if that's something that's important to you, will follow. But I think it's the most important thing is to really find something. I always told my kids when they were 5 and 6 that when I was going to work, I tried never to say I'm going to work. I always said I'm going to play with my friends today, and we're going to make stuff and create stuff. And I think if you can find something that you really enjoy and that you find meaningful, I think that's how I would define success.
I love it. Going to go play with my friends. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story and experiences, so many entrepreneurial stories and lessons. Can you share with the Inspired Money listener, where can they find more about you, about your companies, and follow you?
We have our website. It's Tool of NA, like NorthAmerica.com. And the one for the coffee shop is Good Boy Bob. We have a little dog named Bob. It's named named after our dog, goodboybob.com. Those would be the two places.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Erich.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I enjoyed it.
So what was your favorite inspired money moment? I appreciated hearing that with experience, Erich learned how to ask the right questions. My observation is that his experience did not just come with a bigger ego. He approaches entrepreneurship with the humility to ask the right questions, to listen and make smart decisions. Sometimes that means asking a barista, the person who interfaces with customers every day. There can be great insights learned. Do you have your Inspired Money sticker yet? It looks great on a laptop. Take a screenshot of the podcast along with sharing your favorite book on social media and tag me. I'm inspiredmoney.fm on Instagram or Runnymede-Cap, RUNNYMEDECAP on Twitter. Of course, you can always email me at firm, FIRM, at Runnymede, RUNNYMEDE.com. Inspired Money is edited by Christopher Wright of Wright Media. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're not yet subscribed, I hope that you'll do it right now so that you won't miss next week's episode. I'll see you then. The music you're listening to right now and all other music on today's show is by the amazing Jim Kimo West. Have an inspired week and do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.